Welcome. My name is John Stewart. I'm a psychologist who spent most of his professional life supporting both public and private educators in working with our more complex kids. Today we're going to be talking about work within the school setting with youngsters who are highly dysregulated. We'll define that term in a couple minutes. But these are the kids who present in the school as extremely reactive to even relatively minor stressors. These are the kids who seem to have very little resiliency in response to both real and what sometimes seems to be imagined sources of stress. In the discussion today, I'm going to be talking largely from an attachment and trauma-informed way of thinking about these kids. I don't think there's any question that our culture over the last decades has been so fraught with change, kind of increased separation between the haves and the have-nots. We have a larger and larger percentage of youngsters who are coming into our schools really in pretty tough shape, coming into our schools not in a good position to be able to manage the kind of typical stressors of life in the school. We also are living in a culture that is expecting more and more of our schools, where we're looking to kind of measure or quantify what value the schools have had, what impact they've had through test scores. And we see teachers kind of caught in a bind between an increasing percentage of kids who are showing up in school not really ready to learn, or able to, really coming in with the requisite skills to learn, and expectation for more and more involvement in instruction, and less involvement in the other aspects of what it is to be a caretaker for a child. And I'll use the term caretaker for parents, for teachers, for daycare workers, for therapists. Anybody who has a responsibility to care for a child has a responsibility to do so in a manner that is sensitive to the child's needs and to the best of their ability, motivated to meet those needs. The presentation today is probably going to be about an hour and 15 minutes, an hour and a half. I know that's long if you're sitting in front of a screen. If you are seeing this presentation as part of an in-service training, I certainly want folks to feel like it is perfectly okay to pause it in the middle, take a break, and then come back in. It's okay with me, nor will I know if this is what you've done. So use this in a manner that works for you. The central issue as we talk about kids who are coming to us in this tougher shape, central issue from my perspective is really around connection. It's about the capacity to heal and support, to help these kids heal parts of them that are developmentally delayed because of the nature of the experiences they've had. How to allow them to catch up and to become more resilient. And that the central variable in that is going to be connection. We're going to talk about connection from a couple different angles, and we're also going to talk about another concept that is, I think, increasingly clear as an important part of helping these kids heal. The lead into this presentation, I know that we're going to use some music from Tina Turner. I think in the wisdom of vaudeville, it's always been suggested not to follow an animal or a kid act. I'm not certain I want to follow Tina Turner. She's a pretty impressive performer. But the message in her presentation, what does love have to do with it, I think is a tremendously important aspect of what we need to be thinking about as we serve our more vulnerable kids. Love takes many different forms, and clearly in our role as educators, as research-informed clinicians, our role in working with institutions, we're oftentimes not real comfortable with the L word. But I'll give you a warning that an awful lot of what we're going to be talking about today is going to look an awful lot like a loving response to these kids who are coming to us with some pretty big needs. So with that as an introduction, let's go ahead and jump into our content. I think that one of the ways to think about these more vulnerable kids is to think about them like the canaries in the mine. They do not represent a benign kind of environment for any of us. When the canary went down, it didn't mean, oh, the canary's in trouble, everybody else is fine. When the canary went down, it meant the environment is beginning to become untenable. And it is my sense that as we see an increased number of these complex kids coming into our schools, they are the canaries, giving us a warning that says, take a look at what's going on here. So the title of our presentation is Teaching the Dysregulated Student in the Era of Rising Academic Expectations or Standards. Let's first define a couple terms. Well, the term dysregulated, that's essentially meaning that we have a youngster who is emotionally and behaviorally hyperreactive to stress. Emotionally or behaviorally hyperreactive to stress. Now, stress, what's stress? Stress we're going to define for the purpose of our discussion today as a positive or negative experience or demand which in some manner is challenging, right? Now, stress can be positive, such as looking forward to a vacation can be stressful. A new opportunity that's coming forward can be stressful. However, we're going to be focused more on the negative side of stress today. And we know that positive stress can pretty quickly become negative stress. And we have a youngster who's excited about an upcoming birthday or the holidays, and we see them get excited, which is what we usually refer to kind of positive manifestations of stress. We say they're excited. And we can see that pretty quickly transition to negative manifestation of stress, where we say they're agitated. So stress. Let's talk about it first with respect to a couple different continuums. On the slide that you see, we see the representation on the top of the continuum from acute to chronic. Well, acute stress is associated with a finite event. Acute stress is an event or a moment where there is a demand that is in some way, at least partially and potentially overwhelming. We may have a number of moments in a typical youngster's life or a typical adult's life where you have some acute stress, where you become worried or frightened or concerning some event. But that's in contrast with chronic stress. Chronic stress is associated with those experiences that more of our youngsters than we would like to believe have come to us from. Situations where there's ongoing conflict within the home, situations where there's violence, situations where needs aren't either understood or met. You may have a loving family that wants to protect and meet the child's needs, but in the context of poverty are unable to do so. So we've got these two different types of stress, acute and chronic. And then we've got mild stress and severe stress, the other continuum. Now, mild stress can actually be helpful. Mild stress can kind of promote a better focus. I remember had it not been for stress, I probably would have never studied until I got closer to the date when a paper was due or a test was upcoming. The stress level would go up and my attention and concentration for that content area would go up and you'd get through it. Mild stress, is represented in our photo here of a child who's fallen off a bicycle, is not particularly problematic. It's part of life. It's part of what we have to figure out how to manage and, as I said before, even use. Now, severe stress, in our slide, we represent that with a picture of a child around representing the loss of a parent. Severe stress is a whole other situation. Severe stress is virtually never good for us. Severe stress has the impact of potentially rewiring our brains. It has the impact of dramatically shifting our capacities for access to some of our higher level learning. We're going to talk about that a lot in a few minutes. The fact is that many of the kids who we're here to talk about today come to us with constellations of a real mix of these. Many of them have been exposed to acute stress. Many of them are living in situations that are chronically stressful. They, of course, have mild stress, but many of them have had severe stress. I will say that the vast majority of the youngsters who come to us as dysregulated are kids who have had enormous exposure to stress. Now, you do have the subgroup of kids who are neurologically more susceptible to stress. The kids in the autistic spectrum who don't organize well, and so the world is oftentimes playing out in what feels like a random and unpredictable manner. So even though the environment may be relatively well attuned or tries to be well attuned, the youngster could still be experiencing high levels of stress associated with this. You also see stress associated with youngsters who struggle with health issues, asthma, the terrifying experience of not being able to breathe. So we've got kids who are coming to us with stress responses to a wide range of factors. In our discussion, we're going to break stress into two kind of categories just to help organize our thinking about it a bit. The first is going to be stress associated with a kind of clear sense of safety issues. And the second is going to be challenges associated with our challenge to our sense of self. So let's first talk about what it is to deal with stress associated with fundamental issues of safety. In our slide here, we say that this kind of centers around issues such as, will my needs be met for nourishment? Is my family going to have food? Is my family going to have a home? Am I going to be, safe from the elements? Am I going to be protected from predators? 100 years ago, that might have been a mountain lion out in the frontier. Now, then as well, but now perhaps more so, maybe am I going to be protected from predators in my community, even predators in my family? And the last form of safety is safety from alienation. Really, that kids have a very real need for a sense of connection. We as a species probably evolved associated with our ability to connect, to function as a community, to have specialized tasks, to be able to communicate and manage the environment jointly. So a sense of connection is associated with a fundamental sense of safety. The second variable that we're going to look at is challenges to sense of self as a source of stress. Now, the core dimensions of self that we're going to use, because they're simple, but I also think they're actually pretty helpful, are two dimensions. One, am I competent? And two, am I lovable? If I'm competent, it means that I will have pretty good resources to be able to manage a range of variables that may come my way. That's going to allow me to feel less stressed and safer. If I'm lovable, I'm going to have a fundamental sense that people are going to be there for me. They're going to be there and they're going to want to and try to help me, to help me be safe, to help me have my needs met. If you're fortunate enough to be a child growing up with both of these factors, well, you're going to have a fair amount of resiliency. You're going to run into stressful situations. You're going to believe yourself to be, okay, I'm probably competent enough to get through this. Or if I'm not, I've got people around who love me and they're going to take good care of me. If you're a child who's lacking in one or both of these, the world is not a particularly safe place. Your stress levels are going to be elevated a good deal of the time because of the potential peril associated with not having both of these as aspects of your core sense of self. All right, well, with that understanding of kind of where stress comes from, we're going to move into a discussion of our culture, and particularly the school culture, by use of a metaphor. Periodically, I have been accused of overworking metaphors, and not always kindly. But I assume that, or I'm hoping that you'll indulge me and forgive me if I do tend to overwork this. So it is a weakness. All right, let's talk about this metaphor, the metaphor of the school as a farm. We're going to talk about the soil, which is the culture. We're talking about the plant, which is the student. We're talking about the farmer, which are the teachers, parents, other caretakers certainly are farmers as well, and the harvest. And we're going to talk about the fact that there is a cycle that plays out between these variables. So let's first look at the issue of the soil. The soil, meaning the culture around us, both in the community and within the school, and that the school is a reflection of the broader community. Soil is a place where change is everywhere. If you look at our culture compared to a culture of 100 years ago, it's dramatically different. Moore's Law, the suggestion that every, I think it's 18 months, the capacity for a microchip to hold data doubles. Clearly that's a engineering observation, but many have related it to our culture in general, that our culture is changing so rapidly that the only thing that seems to be constant at this point, aside from hopefully things that are transcendent in a more personal way, but in terms of the broader culture around us, the things that are constant are our need to respond to change. If you were a cobbler, 200 years ago, you learned the skill of what it was to be a cobbler. You had a trade that would last you throughout your life. You would have a way to support your family, a place in the community, a sense of pride around what it is that you had to contribute. That is very different in our current culture. There are few of us who will start our lives and end our lives doing the same type of work. Even if it's in the same field, it's likely to be significantly different, with some exceptions. Some fields are certainly less prone to that kind of change. But the vast majority of us are facing tremendous change on a day-to-day basis within our professions and within the culture as a whole. This makes life more demanding. It means that we can't kind of lay back and say, I'll deal with that tomorrow. We've got to deal with it today, because tomorrow is going to be different. And if we haven't dealt with what we need to deal with today to be ready for tomorrow, we're going to be in trouble. Although there are ways in which the change largely associated with technology has brought some of us closer. We have connections with people around the world much more readily than we did before. Texting, Facebook, Skype, all those kinds of things. They can be in some way connecting. But the depth of connection associated with this technological kind of coming together is clearly distinct from the kind of connection associated with being truly present. So I think that there's little question in most folks' minds that our culture is increasingly isolating. When you look at the impact of just our how mobile our culture is. I had read, I think in one of Bruce Perry's books, a discussion of the typical culture 100 years ago. The infant was generally taken care of by somewhere around 12 adults, adolescents and adults. There was extended family who were actively involved in the caretaking of each infant. And that has gone down to where now it's about 3. And in many families, it's less than that. And there are virtually no unpaid for caretakers in a child's life other than parents. So I think that we're a culture that we move away from each other. We connect electronically. We're a culture where the soil is increasingly disconnected. Things move at increasingly rapid rate, and the time for the slower process of really connecting and having those kind of moments, those kind of transpersonal experiences that cement us together, I don't think there's any question that we have less of those than we had before. If you'll indulge me in another metaphor, looking at the slide, thinking about the river of life, I think 200 years ago, we were like the guy on the left there. And we had been that way for many, many generations. We were on the river of life, working as a riverboat, floating down. We didn't even have a mode of to move any faster than the river. We went down the river and we figured out how to navigate, and we knew where the bends were. We were on maybe our father's boat, our grandfather's boat. We were on the boat together. There are a few moments where rapid decisions were necessary. Well, that's not the culture that we live in currently. The culture that we live in now is much more represented by the guy on the right side. He's heading down the rapids in a high-tech kayak, alone, needing to almost not think, to be just intuitively tuned in to all the changes that lie ahead. This isn't an easy situation. And for those who are less gifted with resources, even financial resources for education, resources to allow to have as much stability as possible, kids who grow up and stay in the same house over the 15 or 18 years of their childhood, well, there's some stability, there's some sameness there. Versus kids who grow up in poverty and maybe end up having to move every 6 months when their family gets behind on rent. There's no question that the greater the stability, the easier life is. Now, I don't think we're all going to hell in a handcart because culture is unraveling, but I do think that we're in a period of rapid transition and we do need to figure out how to respond to this. And it is my hope that our schools, which are a common part of our community, will become increasingly attuned to the need to respond to this rapid change and create more of what it is that kids need, not only as learners, because they do need a sense of the world being predictable as learners, and they do need a sense of a community around them as learners, but they also need it just as learning how to be citizens, how to be with one another. All right, so enough about the soil. Let's move on to our next slide and talk about the plant. Understanding the developing brain and learning. Well, we're going to talk about a particular part of the plant. That's going to be the brain. The plant has other parts to it, and those probably deserve some attention as well. But when we look at where the lion's share of factors play out in a child's life, it is with respect to their neurological development. We're going to look at the brain. We recognize the brain has many different parts. Great strides have been made in understanding the brain and adaptive functioning as a result of neuroimaging techniques being brought into research. But for our relatively simple discussion today of the brain, we look at the brain, look at the lower part of the triangle. We say that's the lower brain, represented by the brain stem, and then we go up a little higher in the diencephalon, the limbic region, and ultimately at the top, the cortical region. That lower part of the brain that we're going to talk a fair amount about today, that lower part of the brain is made up of the brainstem, diencephalon, limbic system. That lower part of the brain has as its primary, if not sole purpose, the protection of safety, the assurance of the body's capacity to respond and manage any threat from the inside or from the outside. So that part of the brain is responsible for regulating pulse, respiration, release of hormones. That part of the brain helps the body internally stay in an operative mode. But it also focuses on the external, focuses on issues of safety with respect to the outside world. It is the part of the brain that activates our defense capacities when in need of them. The upper brain, well, it has a different kind of responsibility. The upper brain is where we do our more abstract learning. The upper brain is where we do the learning that we associate with academics. The upper brain is responsible for learning and understanding our emotional and relational world, learning and understanding our physical world. The upper brain is the place where we take in information, we consciously process it, we hold on to it, and we use it. Now, one of the central messages from today is represented in this next slide, that the brain's response to stress involves almost the full activation of the lower brain. Kids or adults who are operating either under acute or chronic stress have the lower brain highly activated because it is in the mode of attempting to assure a sense of safety and well-being. If we look at the next slide, what it represents is the fact that virtually all information comes in through the lower brain. Sensory input, whether it's tactile, visual, auditory, it comes in through the lower brain, goes up, generally thought to be through the right hemisphere, and then into the left hemisphere of the cortical region. Well, this has some very important implications in terms of learning and work with our more stressed and dysregulated kids. If you look at this next slide, we see that the lower brain impact on learning and efficiency is represented. If we look at the left triangle, and this is coming out of some neuroimaging research. If we look at the left triangle, we see that if 100% of sensory input goes up through the lower brain, in a well-regulated brain, in a brain that is not activated and focused on issues of safety, we see that that information goes up and makes it to the cortical region with pretty high level of efficiency, 90%. If we look at the right slide and we think about both acute and chronically stressed kids whose lower brains are activated, they're always activated, and under minimal stress, they become highly activated. We see that the 100% of input translates into as little as 40% of information actually getting to the cortical region and available for learning. This is some pretty striking information. Under half of the information that is coming in is being processed efficiently enough to make it to the cortical region in highly stressed or dysregulated kids. In our next slide, we see some pretty powerful and for most of you, I imagine, relatively intuitively valid data. On average, moderately to severely dysregulated students fall 6 months behind peers for each year of academic instruction. That's a pretty powerful statistic. That's a pretty powerful and troubling, and I think for most of us, relatively well-known fact. There are a number of things that play into this. One, as we just said, the information isn't getting in efficiently because the youngster's entire state is focused on more primitive, lower brain efforts at safety. We also know that as kids experience themselves as falling behind, as they see themselves relative to their peers as becoming less academically competent, what does that do to their sense of self that we talked about as being so critical? It drops that sense of self and causes the youngster to be even more vulnerable to stress reactions, because as the sense of competency drifts down, the sense of readiness, the need for readiness for an unmanageable, adaptive situation to come up, goes up. So with this understanding, we have some pretty important responsibilities as the farmers working with this increasing number of kids who come in with limitations in their ability to quiet the lower brain, really effectively access learning. So let's turn now to our discussion of the farmers. So as we look at this first slide, say farmers, caretakers, parents, grandparents, teachers. Good caretakers are powerful, wise, and compassionate. So if we're going to be good farmers, our kids are going to have to experience us as powerful, wise, and compassionate. If we're lacking in any one of those three, we're not likely to be particularly successful with kids. But power really isn't about physical strength. It isn't about authority. It is really the power associated with having a strong sense of self, a sense of self that is flexible, that can kind of manage adaptive demands without having our lower brains activated so that we then lose our capacity to be wise and compassionate. So we're going to talk about the wise and compassionate issues more so than the powerful issues. But there's no question that kids need to experience their caretakers as competent, as able to keep them safe by exhibiting wisdom and compassion. All right, so let's take a look at our next slide. Thinking about the management of the chronically dysregulated versus the acutely dysregulated youngster. When dealing with the youngster who is chronically dysregulated, we are going to be involved in the process of trying to create for them an environment that soothes them, that allows them to feel safe. And then we're going to try to provide instruction during that time while they are better regulated. Even though they may be chronically somewhat dysregulated, we're not going to make that all go away. We're going to have to make an environment that works for them, and then we're going to try to teach them to the best of our ability, recognizing that they may not get the 90%, they may get 70%, but they're getting something. So our responsibility in working with a chronically dysregulated youngster when they are not in an acute state is to create an environment in which they can thrive and then to try to provide instruction. And we'll talk about what is involved in an environment that allows a child to thrive. But I wanted to first just take a minute and say there's a difference between a youngster who's chronically dysregulated, who in a given moment is doing okay. You know, we know they're never far from becoming dysregulated, but they're okay. Those kids you can work with, you can instruct. However, when you have a youngster who's in an acute state of dysregulation, a youngster who either is chronically dysregulated and now has had something that's triggered them and they've become acutely dysregulated, or a youngster who maybe isn't chronically dysregulated but has had just a very traumatic experience occur. When you're dealing with an acutely dysregulated youngster, the teaching stops. There is no access to the upper brain, and the only task at hand is to calm that youngster down, is to soothe them, is to help them feel safe again. And that does not entail providing for them contingency-based responses, like you better put that chair down or we're going to call your mother. Not that we all haven't had moments where we've said things like that, but the process of helping an acutely agitated child is complex. Probably the first and most important thing we need to do is calm ourselves and then move forward using some of the strategies that I'm going to be talking about in a moment, which are critical to supporting youngsters who are chronically dysregulated, but they're also essential tools in supporting a youngster who's acutely dysregulated. Okay. So let's begin this discussion by looking at two variables that are essential in the way in which a youngster has their lower brain kind of soothed and providing for them the opportunity to have that fundamental kind of safety. And those two variables are effective caretaking with respect to connection and rhythm. The term rhythm we're going to talk about in more detail. That really, I think Bruce Perry has done some of the nicest work in terms of operationalizing what we mean by rhythm. But we'll get to that in a minute. Let's start out with what it means to facilitate a youngster with respect to a sense of connection. A sense of connection. I don't care whether you're teacher, ed tech, bus driver, parent, psychologist. The task at hand is to form a connection. And in the absence of connection, not much good is going to happen, particularly for youngsters who are more easily dysregulated. We may have a youngster who is pretty well put together, who's had a lot of safety in their life, who feels pretty competent and feels pretty lovable. They may have a bus driver who never says a word to them over the course of the year. And that youngster is probably going to be able to tolerate that. But if we have a youngster who doesn't have that, and that bus driver gives them the slightest cross look, you're going to have a reactive kid. So connection is essential. So let's talk about what does it mean to be connected? How is it that we pursue connections? There's been just such a wonderful wealth of research and writing on this topic over the last 10 years. I think Dan Hughes, Dan Siegel, Alan Shore, there's just many folks who have written eloquently about this. And we're going to draw in our discussion really more from the work of Dan Hughes and Bruce Perry probably than anyone else. So let's look at this whole idea of connection and how it is that we do it. Connection means that the youngster has a sense that the other person has a space inside them where the youngster is seen and known. We sometimes talk about, there's a term that Dan Hughes uses a good deal called intersubjectivity. The child's sense that, and it's actually the intersubjective phenomena goes both ways. It's where both the child and the adult have a sense of being connected, a sense of being known in some important way. A term that's sometimes used is the child's sense of feeling felt. And how critical this is to the quieting of that lower brain in kids who are chronically dysregulated as well as kids who are more acutely dysregulated. And Hughes offers the acronym PACE to help us in understanding how we go about the process of forming connections. So let's look at this together. Quickly, it's playful is what the P represents, accepting, the A, curious, the C, and empathic, the E. And then we're going to come back and talk briefly about the whole notion of connect, tear, repair. Let's look at PACE first. Let's look at this first concept of playfulness, because I think in working with parents who are struggling with a youngster who is dysregulated, or working with a teacher who's struggling with a youngster who's dysregulated, playfulness oftentimes goes out the door. Largely because the caretaker, the farmer, is agitated themselves. They're confused. They're afraid. They're worried about not knowing what this youngster needs or how to meet the youngster's needs, and that doesn't lend to a more playful position in the caretaker's interaction with the child. But when being playful with a child, it affords a sense of connection like few other experiences. It's very difficult to be afraid and playful. That sense of deep belonging. When mom and the little one pretend that the stuffed bear is real and that the stuffed bear has a fever and needs medicine, or that the bridge that the little boy has built with his Legos is a real bridge, and they're big trucks that dad's playing with or mom's playing with, and that kind of shared, almost psychotic blocking out the rest of the world and saying, this is our shared world right here, right now, is just a very powerful form of connection. You know, one of my favorites is what happens in families with pets, is the family shares the delusion that the dog talks and that they project all these human qualities on the family pet. and that there's just a sense of playful shared reality. Playfulness is hugely underrated as an avenue in with dysregulated kids, both with chronic and acutely dysregulated kids. Our ability to find ways in which to gently and playfully connect with a frightened youngster is hugely powerful in allowing them to feel safer with us, and feel safer in general. So playfulness, and Dan Hughes writes about these eloquently. So if I've captured your imagination with this, I would recommend that you read some of Hughes's work. The Attachment Focused Parenting, I think, is an excellent book. Brain-based parenting, and if you're a clinician, I think the finest thing I have read for work with families is Hughes's Attachment Focused Family Therapy workbook. So let's move on to the second of the directives. That's accepting. For the child to have a sense that they are deeply, profoundly, and fully accepted. Now, I want to make a distinction here, and Dan Siegel does this very nicely in The Whole Brain Child, that acceptance means the acceptance of the child's thoughts and feelings, no matter what they are. It is not acceptance of all behavior. There is a place for containment. There's a place for rules, and there's a place for reasonable consequences. There's no place for offering reasonable consequences in a highly agitated youngster. The only task there, as you remember, is to help them calm down, not to say, if you don't calm down, this is what's going to happen. But the fundamental capacity to be accepting is, and for the child to experience it, is huge. When a child tells us that, I'm stupid, I can't do what everybody else does, and then we immediately move into saying, oh, no, buddy, you're not stupid. This is hard for you, but you're so good at these other things. That's a very loving, motivated, that kind of response is motivated by love and caring. It's unfortunately oftentimes not particularly helpful. If we can meet the child where they are, as the child says, I'm stupid, or the child says, you hate me, to a parent who's having to set a limit, to being able to stop and go, oh, buddy, how hard that must be to feel like you're not smart. That ability to be present with a child with emotions that are difficult is a profound and very important aspect of acceptance. So learning as a parent to not try to talk your youngster out of their feelings, but rather figure out how to walk beside them. And then they will help. They'll find their way out once they've regained some sense of our being with them. The next, and this is a very quick once over of these important concepts. The next is curious, is our ability to be curious with our kids. But curiosity is only connecting if it's done in the context of acceptance. If I am curious with a child about, my goodness, your homework got done much more quickly than I thought you would get it done, that is experienced by kids as your effort to get information to build a case. Kids, teenagers in particular, what did you do at school today? Nothing. They don't want to give you information. They're very, very concerned that all information will be used against them. And it often creates a situation where one of the worst ways to get information from a youngster or to be connected with a youngster is to ask them a lot of questions. But once a child experiences a deep sense of acceptance, and your questions are asked without a sense of judgment connected to them, your homework didn't take as long tonight. I'm glad. Sometimes it feels like you're up there having to work so long at it. Where there's this expression of acceptance of something that you're observing, you're likely to have a child engage with you and begin to talk to you about whatever the reality is. So curiosity is a way of letting kids know that they're important to us, that we're interested in them. If you have a youngster who who is going home and you know that he said he was going to get a new dog that night, or his uncle was going to be coming to visit. When they come into the classroom and say, hey, did your uncle come? Or did you guys get the dog? Uh, those kinds of ways of being curious show the child that they live within us, that they have a place within us, and that they matter. I think also when dealing with an upset kid, being able to express a deep kind of acceptance by sitting down next to them, not pushing them towards providing you a lot of information, just letting them see that you're okay, just connecting, but then being curious and saying, things like, buddy, I know you make sense. You're upset and there's a reason for it. Can you help me understand it? Maybe you can't, but maybe you can. That kind of curiosity that's expressed with acceptance is profoundly connecting. And I think that, unfortunately, as we oftentimes find ourselves not having a whole lot of time for the work that we're doing with kids, we don't have much time to connect. We don't have much time to be playful. We don't have much time to be expressed acceptance or to be curious. And I think we're going to pay a price for that. I think we are paying a price for it. And once again, I think Bruce Perry's book, Born for Love, just provides an eloquent discussion of what lies ahead for us, essentially, if we don't figure out how to make connection a more critical part of our culture, and particularly our educational culture. So we've got playful, accepting, curious, and the last is empathic. And empathy is probably the easiest to understand, and I guess most of us would recognize that empathy is a critical variable of when thinking about connection. Empathy just means, I get it. Saying, I get it. Of course that's what you feel. And feeling it together. One of the things we want to be careful about is using too many words with kids and with adults for that matter. Our nonverbals are processed much more rapidly, 10 to 20, sometimes I've seen it said they're processed 100 times faster than verbal input. So our tone of voice, our facial expression, our posture. When you're dealing with an upset kid, get smaller than that child. Use a quiet voice. Slow down your breathing, because that's what they're paying attention to. They're paying attention to that much more than any words that come out of your mouth. So just learning to pay attention to your nonverbals as you attempt to approach the child with pace in mind. All things, pace in mind. Playful, accepting, curious, and empathic. Now, with some kids, you can't approach it with a really upset youngster. If I try to be playful with them right out of the gate, that's going to be an empathic miss. They're going to think I'm not taking their pain seriously, or they're being upset seriously. So it's not in that sequence of automatically playful, accepting, curious, empathic. It's wherever you enter, wherever kind of your heart and your own intuition tells you I can enter. Sometimes it's with curiosity, sometimes it's empathy, sometimes it's expression of acceptance, and sometimes it's playfulness. So pace in all things. Let's look at the next slide. This is another key concept that comes out of attachment-focused research and theory, practice. Connect, tear, and repair. Relationships are like muscles. Relationships are strengthened by the inevitability of the tear that's followed by the healing. There is no such thing as a relationship with a child, a partner, a parent, where the relationship doesn't tear. Relationships get torn. We miss an empathic moment. We have a situation that we have no choice but to do something that the child is not going to like. That's a tear. Tears are not the problem. They happen. We want to minimize them, but tears happen in relationships. But I want to be really clear that when you're working with children, the responsibility to repair the tear is the adult's. It is always the responsibility of the adult to repair the tear. When I hear parents saying things like, well, he needs to apologize and then we can go forward. Well, That's not going to work. The youngster needs to see you teach him how to repair. He needs to see that the relationship matters enough to you to repair it. The repair process is hugely healing, but it is the responsibility of the adult. Also remember, the repair is not a teaching moment. Well, buddy, I wouldn't have given you a timeout, or you wouldn't have had to miss recess if it weren't for the fact that you didn't do your homework. Now, that's true, and that can oftentimes be presented gently, but it's not particularly helpful. I think that think about your relationship with your spouse or your partner. The idea that when they say, I'm sorry I did that, but had you not done this, I wouldn't have needed to do that. That's trying to take a repair and teach something in the process. The whole purpose of the repair is to say, I'm sorry. I'm sorry we lost each other. I'm sorry that was painful for you. Not, I'm sorry that was painful for you, but I needed to do it. Just stick with the I'm sorry. That's not easy for a lot of folks to do. I've gotten better at it. maybe because I've needed more forgiveness than most. But make it real. It has to be real. Find that part of you that empathizes with that other person and their pain. And they may have created pain for you as well. And with adults, sometimes it's one and sometimes it's the other who has to take the responsibility for the repair. In some relationships, the repair that work gets carried by one member of the relationship more than the other, because maybe that person has a little more self-esteem, they're a little better able to take some responsibility. But in work with kids and teenagers, the repair has to be pursued by the adult. Has to be seen as something that's not a teachable moment, and it has to be real. You have to find that part of you that says, I'm sorry that hurt. I'm sorry that played out that way. So if we think about PACE, and when PACE doesn't work, we then use our repair of the relationship. Hugely powerful in the promotion of connection, and the type of connection that allows kids' lower brains to quiet, and they're learning to be optimized. There's one cautionary note that I do want to make. Many of the kids who we're talking about as chronically dysregulated, many of these kids have had frightening, poorly attuned encounters with adults. And so as we try to connect with them, their initial reaction is to pull back. And oftentimes that pulling back can take the form of a fight. As we try to connect, we scare them. The connection frightens them. And so they're aggressive towards us, or they run, or they freeze and they don't react to us. And one of the things that, one of my favorite sayings that was taught to me by a superintendent of schools on one of the islands off the coast of Maine. He was about 80 years old. And he said that when he had new teachers in his school system, he said he taught them one rule right out of the gate was that there was no such thing as a neutral interaction with a child. That your interaction either moves that child up or pushes that child down. If you walk by a child and you do not say hello, you do not have eye contact, you've just conveyed to that child that they're invisible and they don't really matter. That's, I think, a wonderful thing for us to carry to the best of our ability within the school settings, that there is no such thing as a neutral interaction. Because if we are all about connection, we're all about having a child experience us as committed to connection. The first time you say hi to a child who doesn't know you, if they're a youngster with a difficult history, they look at you like, what the hell's wrong with you? The second time you walk by that youngster and you say hi to them, they look at you and give you kind of a little bit confused, but not so hostile kind of reaction. The third and the fourth and the fifth time, it gets softer and softer. And down the road a little ways, that child's looking for you in the hallway. They're looking for you to be able to say, "Hi, Joe. How are you doing today?" Recognizing that just because the youngster doesn't appear to want to connect doesn't mean they don't. It just means that the experiences they've had have taught them that connection is potentially fraught with risk. So we hold on to that as our goal is pace in all things, connecting whenever we can, tearing, or we don't intentionally tear, but dealing with tears in the relationship by pursuing repair. I want to say one more thing about this whole notion of connection before we move into the topic of rhythm. Not all of us come to this obligation for connection as ready as others. Some of us have had much easier times in our own relational histories that make it easier for us to take the risk. So our own attachment history, our own relational history plays a part in how accessible and how ready and able we are to try to make a connection with a child. But the more we know that, the more we know about our history, there's a lot of really interesting research on attachment style that suggests that if we've had a difficult start in life, if we understand that and we have a narrative or a story that says it shouldn't have been that way, these things happened and they shouldn't have happened, that frees us from repeating the experiences that we had. That if we don't have a narrative that helps us understand why those things happened that shouldn't have happened, we're much more likely to repeat it. So, we've all had different kinds of histories, and nobody chooses their history. Nobody chooses to be in a family that doesn't have the resources to be able to nurture as effectively as another. But it happens. And so this whole notion of connecting with kids, we do have to look at our own experiences and say, all right, what do I know about me? And what do I maybe have to work on in being more accessible to a child? We also know that stress and pressure from competing obligations gets in the way of connection. It's one of the things I hear from teachers, probably more often than anything else, is I used to have time to really know and be with my kids. But now the expectation around standards really doesn't allow me that opportunity. And just a deep sense of sadness about the limited opportunity to be playful, to be accepting, to be curious, to be empathic, because there's curriculum that needs to be taught. I'm not saying that they can't be put together, but I think we have to be very careful about putting the academics so far ahead of the development of the self of the child. We also have situations where there's a temperamental mismatch. Maybe I'm somebody who enters the process of connection more through playfulness than empathy, but I may be dealing with a child who doesn't really understand or manage playfulness very well. Some of our kids in the autistic spectrum, I know the kids with Asperger's, they oftentimes can be very playful and fun, but that's not the starting point. And it's actually something I've had to be careful about, is being too playful with ASD kids prior to their kind of knowing me in a way. So, these are just some of the variables that can make it difficult in our effort to provide the kind of connection that heals and quiets those lower brains and makes kids ready and accessible to learning. The next concept that we want to talk about is rhythm. And rhythm is it's a term that I believe Bruce Perry coined, and I like it. I'm going to present some of Perry's perspective and some of mine, but rhythm is essentially repetitive experience, and sometimes it's repetitive in the short term, and sometimes it's repetitive over a longer period of time. And I think about it, and this is not Perry's, but I think about it as bottom-up rhythm, which is sensory rhythm, and top-down, which is rhythm associated with predictable, structured, and kind of ritualized experience. It's important when we're thinking about rhythm, whether it's the bottom up or top down, that rhythm is healing and supportive, particularly when mediated through relationship, when there is another person around. So suggesting that providing youngsters experience sensory experiences of rhythm, like a metronome ticking in the background, is not likely to be useful in this regard. But the metronome in the background with an adult swinging hands with a child in time with the metronome, that would be a mediated rhythm. So let's talk about the bottom-up rhythm first. It's kind of the one that I think most of us haven't really thought about. And it is, as I have become aware of it and have been working with teachers and clinicians and parents and looking at how to utilize it, it's become increasingly clear to me that it has tremendous power. The idea is that we as humans have developed a very powerful association between rhythm and a state of safety, and that we come out of the womb with that. What is in the background the entire time that the child is in the blissful state of having all needs met in utero? Well, it's the mother's heartbeat. And that rhythm at about 80 beats per minute has been demonstrated across cultures as the rate at which people rock upset little ones. And that much below that tends to actually cause dysregulation, and much above that causes dysregulation. What do we do if there is a youngster, or a little one, let's say an infant in the next room, and they're crying? Well, we go in, we look at them, we assess, and we go, what's going on here? We pick them up, we connect, and then we begin to rock them. We may even sing to them while we try to figure out what their need is. Rhythm has this remarkable capacity to slow that lower brain down. Rhythm can be played out in many different ways. Having a youngster jump on a mini tramp while you hold their hands and count their jumps, or sing a rhyme with them as they jump. Having a youngster, one of the teachers that I work with had a 13-year-old girl who was very dysregulated. And she and the little girl discovered that they could take the iPod and they could each put one earphone in, because it was stereo. And sitting in their chair, they could dance together with their hands. In some of Perry's material, he talks about having kids who have a job of sweeping the floor, the rhythmic motion back and forth. Or reading books that have a syncopated quality to them, Dr. Seuss poetry, singing. Just the idea that rhythm has a way of quieting the brain. One of the things that in the day treatment program where I'm clinical director, one of the things that we do with our little guys, many of them, when they're having a hard time, they'll say they want to be rolled up in a taco. And so we roll them up in a blanket. And we've discovered that if we do karate chops on them, rather than just doing deep muscle kind of massaging as a way of connecting and quieting, that the karate chops done rhythmically are more effective. So this is something just to play with, that bottom-up rhythm. I watch parents in line at a carnival or waiting for a movie a child's excited about, and you watch the parent who has the intuitive sense of having the little one's hands and the little one's excited, and having the little one standing on their feet, and while dad rocks back and forth, moving his feet. We do have a pretty good intuitive sense that rhythm is quieting, but we tend not to take it into I think the classroom, the way in which we can. I have a high school classroom that I consult to, a program for kids with behavioral issues. And I've been doing a hard sell of having them do a drumming circle and getting the band teacher to come and help them with rhythms. And so I think I've got them won over, but I'll see whether or not they actually do it. The second type of rhythm is what I call top-down rhythm, and that's the rhythm associated with the world being predictable, with that's associated with rules being followed, schedules being followed. It's 10 o'clock. Well, it's 10 o'clock. I'm supposed to be doing this. Whenever there is an expectation that then gets met, there's an aspect of rhythm in that. A routine of eating dinner every night at 5:30, bedtime rituals, getting up in the morning rituals. Rituals help kids and adults have a quieter lower brain. So rituals, classroom rules, they can be managed in a way that's not soothing, but they can also be managed in a way that's very helpful. When the teacher is able to use the rules as their ally, and when the teacher needs to set a limit based upon the rules and says, oh buddy, that's the rule, I'm sorry, and knows how to set the rule and then run around on the other side and support the child in tolerating the rule. When a child is confronting a limit or a consequence, it's one of the times when they need us most there to keep their brains quiet so that they can actually learn from the experience. So I think I used the illustration before that the classroom rule is if you don't do your homework, you have to stay in until your homework's done. Stay in for recess till your homework's done. And if the teacher can do that with pace and say, oh, Billy, I'm sorry, buddy. You can't go out, that rule, but I'll sit here, I'll give you a hand here, and I bet we can do this thing as fast as Superman if we sit down and we do it together real quick. That sense of helping the child encounter the rule as a structure that's predictable and it's upheld, but they're not left alone to figure out how to manage some of the frustration associated with it. It's a real gift to be able to set a consequence, set a rule, set a boundary, and then figure out how to very quickly go over and help the child tolerate it. But it's an important skill, particularly in working with our more dysregulated kids. So I'm not going to talk a great deal about rhythm, but I do want to say structure, 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 but structure done with padded boundaries. Padded boundaries just means that the youngster knows that there are rules and there are consequences, but if the child violates the rule, that the consequences be done in a way that's gentle. There's nothing to be gained by a highly kind of coercive manner of responding to a child who is now having a consequence. The difference between punishment and with kids who are highly dysregulated, punishment will almost always activate an acute response. The difference between punishment and an effective consequence or a padded boundary is how it's delivered. It's about saying, oh, buddy, using your voice, being aware of those nonverbals. Oh, buddy, I'm sorry, but you can't go out to recess. That nonverbal says, I'm with you. And I'm going to help you figure out what to do with this situation. As opposed to saying, well, you know the rules, you didn't do your homework, so you're not going out to recess. Now, none of us would like to think that we could ever say anything to a child like that, but we can, in a bad moment, under stress, but that's not who we want to be. It's not how we want to operate with kids. So let's look for a minute, kind of moving from connection and rhythm. Let's look for a minute at some of the challenges to connection and rhythm associated with increased academic demands. I think some of the unintended impact of the need to get more and more content into kids. It affects how the school day plays out. How much time is there for recess? How much time is there for lunch? How much free play time is there? How much time is there for a teacher to be with a child who's having a hard time? Or do we just hope to hell he's going to get through it and put him on the bus? The school culture, clearly the more connected we are, the more gentle the school culture. The idea that empathy, Mary Gordon, who's the founder of a wonderful program called Seeds of Empathy, one of the things she says is that empathy is caught, it's not taught. And when we're moving so fast, trying to get content in, we oftentimes don't have the opportunity to express the very empathy that's going to allow our kids to catch it and have it become a part of our overall school climate. Teachers are under tremendous stress. I've spent most of my life professionally working with teachers, and I I have such respect for teachers, and I have such respect for how important they are in kids' lives. But boy, if we keep coming at teachers and saying content, test scores are the things that matter, our teachers, their lower brains get rattled and they become less effective at all that they do. Our students, their relationship with each other are impacted by the culture, as we talked about in the farming metaphor, that how the kids come out based upon the experiences they have impacts the culture, and we're off into the cycle. So our ability within our student body, our ability within our community as a whole to honor the importance of empathy and compassion. We won't be a lesser culture for it. Empathy and compassion will ultimately, I think, rule the day in allowing a culture to really thrive as opposed to just survive. So let's take one last look at our metaphor and say, all right, what's the harvest? What do we come out of this experience with kids with? Well, I know test scores are important. I like kids to learn. But if we pursue test scores and have a larger and larger percentage of our kids not able to tolerate the stress, we're in trouble. We're in trouble. If we get the test scores up and we promote connection and empathy, well, then we enrich the soil and the culture is the better for it. If we get the test scores up and we have more and more disabled citizens, I'm afraid our soil becomes more depleted and we're off into a very negative cycle. This is what I see us as caretakers with kids, educators, what I see us as having just an enormous responsibility when you look at the amount of time that we spend with kids and the number of kids who are coming into us in some pretty tough shape. So the harvest of choice, we want happy, connected, empathic kids, ready and able to learn, ready to learn. And we do that through connection, we do it through rhythm, we do it through empathy. Pace in all things. So as we go back to Tina and we ask, what's love got to do with it? Well, maybe everything. Maybe everything. So I want to thank you for spending some time with me. At the end of the slides here, there will be some references of folks that I've cited, ways to contact me if you would be interested in having some kind of ongoing involvement. I'm currently doing a virtual school consultation supervision model, which is going to be starting the end of January 2014. Also available and happy to do presentations in school systems when that feels like that's helpful. So best of luck. You're doing incredibly important work. And if I can be of any help, please let me know. Thanks.